of fire, this is the God of love, this is the God of justice, this is the God of trade, etc. And each God has its own sacrifices and rituals and different things. Whereas when Allah says Rabbul Alameen and He describes Himself as Rabbul Alameen, He has gotten rid of every single concept that anything in the universe is run by other than Him, or supported by other than Him, or created by other than Him, or sustained through other than Him, subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is the essence of Tawheed. And then we see the next verse after that is Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. And these are the two beautiful names of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that deal with His mercy. What do these correspond with in terms of a theme in the Quran? This corresponds with all of the promises of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Anytime Allah has promised to give us mercy, He's promised to give us Jannah, He's promised to give us something that we can benefit from, He's promised to give us something that He wants us to believe and strive towards. All of these things are considered to be the wa'ad of Allah, the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so the wa'ad of Allah is connected to Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim. And then the verse after that is Malik Yawmiddin, the day, the king or the authority on the day of judgment. And all of this is concerned with the wa'id, the threat of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When Allah is reminding you that He is the Malik, He is the king, He's the sole ruler, and He's the authority of Yawm al-Qiyamah, this is Him reminding us that there will be a time when we will have to think about what we're doing in this world, because we're going to have to answer to Him on the day of judgment. And all of the threats and the punishments that Allah gives us in the Quran, such as threatening us with punishment, threatening us with hellfire, threatening us with all of these different things, these threats are all threats that will come manifest on Yawm al-Qiyamah. Allah gives refuge to everybody in this world, because this is the abode of Rahmah, and even people who disobey Him, even people who sin, even people who oppose Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, they find themselves being given their provisions here in this world, they find themselves living comfortably in this world, they find themselves being not aware that they will be punished in this world even, because Allah is saving all of their punishments and saving everything that He has threatened them with for the Akhirah, where it will be more everlasting and it will be something that will continue until the end of time. خَالِدِينَ فِيهَا أَبَدًا, as Allah describes in the Quran. And then we see now the next aspect of the Quran, which is represented by إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, you alone do we worship. And this is everything to do with the Sharia, everything to do with the rules and regulations that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us, and the commandments and the prohibitions. The only way in which we can manifest our ubudiyyah, our servant to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and the only way we can approach Him through ibadah, through worshipping Him, is through imtithal bil-awamir wa ijtinabu an al-nawahi. Practicing what He's commanded us to do, and staying away from what He's forbidden us from doing. And so when we say إِيَّاكَ نَعْبُدُ, this indicates everything in the Quran to do with the rules and regulations of the Sharia, and the origins of the Sharia, and the ayat al-ahkam, the verses that deal with the commandments of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And then إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, that has everything to do with the haqiqah, the spiritual reality of existence. And all of the verses in the Quran that deal with the haqiqah, the realities behind all of the worship, the realities behind our relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, is represented by this verse, إِيَّاكَ نَسْتَعِينُ, you alone do we seek for support. And this is actually the true Tawheed, or what they call Tawheedul Khas, the special Tawheed. And an example of this is, if we look in the Quran, we see, for example, Allah describes Himself as Ar-Razaq, the one that gives us our provision. But each and every single one of us, we achieve our provisions through different aspects, through different means. Some of us go out to work, some of us farm, some of us trade, some of us are employees, some of us are gifted by rich parents or rich aunties and uncles. All of these different ways in which our rizq comes to us, it comes to us through what we perceive to be other than Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But the reality of the situation is that Allah is the one who created that rizq, and He created the people who give us the rizq, and then He, through His power and His might, makes it easy for us to obtain that rizq from the people who He has entrusted it for us to. And so, true Tawheed is recognizing that rizq is only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But you also recognize that Allah has created different asbab, different means for us to achieve that rizq. In the same way, support and inayah is only from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we say to Allah, Iyaka nasta'een, you are the only one through whom we seek support, that's us recognizing the origin of everything in existence being the power and the might and the strength of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His creative faculties and His creative abilities. But we all seek aid through different things. If we have, for example, a baby when it's hungry will cry and seek the aid of its mother in order to achieve milk or to get milk to quench its thirst. Each and every single one of us go to different aspects of creation to seek support in different things or to get support for different things. But the reality, the haqiqah of the situation is that all of this support was created by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, belongs to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and will return to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And so this is the haqiqah aspect of the Quran, and we see this many times in the Quran. So for example, there's a verse in the Quran when Allah was speaking about one of the battles, and He says to the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, وَمَا رَمَيْتَ إِذْ رَمَيْتَ وَلَكِنْ اللَّهُ رَمَى, that you did not throw when you threw, but rather it was Allah that threw. We know that it was the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam who threw, but Allah took that action and attributed it to Himself because He wanted them to be able to see the haqiqah, the reality behind that situation. And so these verses like Iyaka nasta'een is the representation of all of these kind of verses in the Quran that allow you to think deeply about the relationship between Allah and His creation and understand the haqiqah, the reality behind the relationship between Allah and His creation. Another one, for example, is when the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam was giving bay'ah to the people in Africa, and he put his hand above their hands, and they all pledged allegiance to him, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, or pledged allegiance to Allah through him. Allah, when speaking about that in the Quran, says, Yadullah fawqa aydihim, that the hand of Allah was above their hand. We know that Allah's hand was not physically above their hand, but the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam's hand was above their hand. But the Prophet's hand was representing the hand of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in that interaction. So all of these things are the ayat to do with haqiqah, the spiritual realities, and all of these things are present in the Quran, and they're represented by Iyaka nasta'een. Then we see, Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim, guide us to the straight path. Ihdina as-siratal mustaqim is what? It's a dua. And so all of the du'as in the Quran are represented by this dua. The Quran is a book that is full of du'as, all of the Allahummas and all of the Rabbanas, you can count them, and there are over 100 of them from different prophets and different salihin, and the ways in which Allah teaches us to approach Him. All of the Rabbanas and all of the Allahummas in the Quran should be studied in depth and should be spoken about one by one. Because Allah, in revealing the Quran and revealing the ayah in which He tells us, فَادْعُونِي أَسْتَجِيبُ لَكُمْ, make dua to me and I'll respond to you, He also sends down His du'as to teach us how to make dua to Him and what we need to ask for and what we need to look for. Because for many of us, when we're left to our own devices and we make our own du'as for ourselves, number one, we won't make du'as that are beneficial to us, and number two, we won't be able to reflect on the attributes of Allah and what Allah wants us to know about Him through these du'as. And I'll give you a specific example. In the end of Surah Baqarah, Allah reveals a dua in which this is the last verses of Surah Baqarah have been described by the Prophet ﷺ as being a treasure from amongst the treasures underneath the throne of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah reveals this dua to us and orders us to approach Him through this dua. And this dua is, رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَّسِينَا أَوْ أَخْطَأْنَا رَبَّنَا وَلَا تَحْمِلْ عَلَيْنَا إِصْرًا كَمَا حَمَلْتُ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِن قَبْلِنَا رَبَّنَا وَلَا تُحَمِّلْنَا مَا لَا طَاقَةَ لَنَا بِهِ وَاعْفُ عَنَّا وَاغْفِرْ لَنَا وَارْحَمْنَا أَنْتَ مَوْلَانَا فَانصُرْنَا عَلَى الْقَوْمِ الْكَافِرِينَ. This is a very, very deep dua. Allah tells us to say to Him, رَبَّنَا لَا تُؤَاخِذْنَا إِن نَّسِينَا أَوْ أَخْطَأْنَا. Oh Allah, do not hold us to account if we forget or if we make a mistake. That means Allah is teaching us that He will never punish us for something if we're doing it out of making a mistake or out of forgetting. if we approach him and we ask him to forgive us for it. And what's interesting is that any sin that you do, you only do the sin because you forget about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at the time, or you make a mistake. So there's no other way for us to sin. We're either going to make the mistake or we're going to forget. And Allah's guaranteeing us and showing us that if we approach him after we make this mistake, or after we forget, he'll definitely forgive us for that sin and he'll not hold us to account. This is something that he wanted to teach us about himself through this dua. رَبَّنَا وَلَا تَحْمِلْ عَلَيْنَا إِسْرًا كَمَا حَمَلْتَهُ عَلَى الَّذِينَ مِنْ قَبْلِنَا. And he asks us to ask him to not burden us with something similar to what those before us have been burdened with. What does this mean? This means that throughout the Quran and throughout even the Hadith and the Sunnah, we see the stories of our pious predecessors, Salaf al-Salih, and all of the prophets who came before us, and all of the difficulties that they faced in life, and all of the challenges that they faced in life, and all of the ways in which they were tested by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Allah is asking us to ask him to make our test easy, and not to be tested in the same way that those before us have been tested. Even though Allah guarantees that he's going to test us, he asks us to ask him to make it light on us and make it easier on us. Because he wants to show us that with every generation and with every new creation that he creates from amongst human beings, he wants to make the test easier and easier for them. And if we compare our lives, for example, to the lives of the Sahaba, we realize that even though we're being tested, we can never be tested to the level that the Sahaba were tested. None of us have been taken to the middle of the desert and had hot stoves placed on our chest because of our tawheed, because of our religion. None of us had been forced to leave our families and our homes and our property behind in Mecca and follow the Prophet ﷺ to Medina without any possessions and without any of our worldly affairs, without any career, without any jobs, just because of our iman in Allah and the Prophet ﷺ. None of us have been tested with drought. None of us have been tested with severe hunger. None of us have been like the family of the Prophet ﷺ when Aisha radiallahu anha describes that the Prophet ﷺ could sometimes be in his house for 2 months and the oven would never turn on. And the entirety of that 2 months, they just used to drink water and eat dates. Imagine the iftar that we have today, where they give you the water and they give you the dates. And you drink the water and you eat the dates to break your fast, and then you think, okay, but now I'm going on to the watermelon, and I'm going on to the samosas and the pakoras and the this and that. But the Prophet ﷺ would stay in his house for 2 months and not consume anything except water and dates. None of us have been tested with that. All of these different things, none of us have been tested with jihad, none of us have been tested with battle, none of us have been put on the front line and seen our father or seen our brother or seen our siblings on the other side. There was a story, Sayyidina Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu, during the battles of Badr and Uhud, etc. He had a son that had not become Muslim and was fighting on the side of the Quraysh against him. And so anytime his son would see his father Abu Bakr in the battle, he would avoid him, tell him not to fight him or not to kill him. And so after a while, he took Shahada and he came back to Sayyidina Abu Bakr, and they were talking and they were discussing. And he said to his dad, Abu Bakr, he said, do you know how many times I saw you in battle